3 days ago, the United States government's own budget office released a report that should have stopped the entire country in its tracks. It did not. Most people scrolled right past it. But the numbers inside that report describe something that has not happened since the end of World War II. And this time, there is no war to justify it. The Congressional Budget Office, the nonpartisan scorekeeper that Congress itself relies on, projected that the national debt will reach $56 trillion within 10 years. As a share of the economy, that is 120% of GDP. The previous record, 106%, was set in 1946, when the country was demobilizing millions of soldiers after defeating Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. America is about to break that record, not because of a war, not because of a pandemic, because of the accumulated cost of spending more than it collects year after year after year, and then borrowing to cover the difference, and then borrowing again to pay the interest on what it already borrowed. That last part is the one almost nobody understands. And it is the part that turns a manageable problem into a death spiral. Right now, the United States government is paying approximately $1 trillion per year just in interest on its existing debt. $1 trillion. That is not building roads. That is not funding schools. That is not paying soldiers or doctors or scientists. That is the government writing checks to bondholders, many of them foreign governments, simply for the privilege of having borrowed money in the past. And that number is projected to more than double. By 2036, annual interest payments will reach $2.1 trillion. At that point, interest on the debt will consume nearly 19% of all federal spending. Almost 1 out of every $5 the government spends will go to debt service. Not to programs, not to people, to interest. Ray Dalio, the founder of the world's largest hedge fund, a man who has spent 5 decades studying how economies rise and fall, has been warning about this for years. But in 2025 and 2026, his warnings became something different. They became urgent. At the World Economic Forum in Davos in January 2026, Dalio told an audience of the world's most powerful leaders and CEOs that the United States is experiencing what he calls the breakdown of the monetary order. He posed a question that no one in the room could answer. Do you print money, or do you let a debt crisis happen? That is not a rhetorical question. It is the actual choice the country faces. And both options lead to pain. If you print money to cover the debt, which is what central banks do when they buy government bonds with newly created currency, you devalue the money already in circulation. Prices rise, savings lose purchasing power. The people who suffer most are the people who can least afford it. Retirees on fixed incomes, workers whose wages do not keep up with inflation, families who saved responsibly and watched their savings melt. If you do not print money, if you let the debt crisis happen, interest rates spike, the government cannot fund its obligations, markets crash, and the economy contracts. Dalio compared this dynamic to cardiovascular disease. He said debt service payments are like plaque building up in the arteries. For years, the patient feels fine. The doctor warns them. They ignore it because nothing has gone wrong yet. And then one day, the blood flow is so restricted that the heart simply stops. An economic heart attack, his exact words. And the data from the CBO report released 3 days ago confirms that the plaque is building faster than anyone expected. Here is what most people miss about government debt. They think of it like household debt. You borrow money, you pay it back, end of story. But government debt is fundamentally different because the government can do 3 things a household cannot. It can tax, it can borrow, and it can print the currency in which its debts are denominated. Those 3 tools give governments enormous flexibility. They are the reason the United States has never defaulted on its debt. But those tools have limits. And the CBO report shows the country is approaching those limits faster than at any point in its history. Start with taxation. The government currently collects revenue equal to about 17% of GDP. Spending is at 23%. The gap, 6% of GDP, is the annual deficit. To close that gap through taxation alone, you would need the largest tax increase in American history. Politically impossible. Now try spending cuts. The biggest categories of federal spending are Social Security, Medicare, defense, and interest on the debt. Together, those 4 categories consume nearly 80% of the federal budget. You cannot cut interest. It must be paid. Cutting Social Security or Medicare is politically toxic, and defense spending is being increased, not decreased. The math does not work. No combination of realistic spending cuts closes the gap, which leaves the third tool, printing money. The Federal Reserve can create new dollars and use them to buy government bonds. This is what happened during the 2008 financial crisis, and again during the pandemic in 2020. It works in the short term. It stabilizes markets. It prevents immediate default. But it devalues the currency. And when you devalue the currency of the world's reserve currency, the dollar that every central bank holds, that every oil contract is priced in, that every international trade is settled in, you do not just affect Americans, you affect everyone. This is where Dalio's analysis becomes terrifying. He has studied 500 years of economic history. He has mapped the rise and fall of the Dutch guilder, the British pound, and now the American dollar as the world's dominant reserve currency. In every case, the pattern was the same. The empire rises on innovation, productivity, and sound money. It becomes the world's financial center. Other nations hold its currency as reserves. Its government borrows cheaply because the world trusts it. And then, gradually, it borrows too much. The spending exceeds the income. The debt compounds. The empire tries to maintain its lifestyle by borrowing against its reputation. And eventually, the reputation erodes, the currency weakens, and a new power emerges to replace it. The Dutch cycle lasted roughly 150 years. The British cycle lasted roughly 200. The American cycle began after World War II. It has been 80 years. And Dalio's conclusion is that the United States is now in what he calls Phase 5 of the big debt cycle, the final phase before the monetary order breaks down. Phase 5 is the phase where every attempt to fix the problem makes it worse. Cut spending, and you trigger a recession that reduces tax revenue. Raise taxes, and you slow the economy, which also reduces revenue. Print money, and you devalue the currency, which causes foreign holders to sell their bonds, which forces interest rates higher, which increases the debt burden. Every door leads to the same room. In Phase 5, debt becomes so large that even central banks cannot service it without destroying the value of the currency. The government borrows to pay interest. The central bank prints money to keep interest rates from spiking. The currency weakens. Foreign investors, who hold trillions of dollars in American bonds, start selling. China has already reduced its treasury holdings to $730 billion, or the lowest level since 2008. When foreign buyers retreat, the government must offer higher interest rates to attract new buyers. But higher interest rates mean higher interest payments, which means more borrowing, which means more printing, which means more currency devaluation, which means more foreign selling. The spiral feeds on itself. Each turn makes the next turn worse, and there is no brake pedal. The CBO report puts specific numbers on this spiral for the first time. Total deficits over the next decade, $23.1 trillion. Debt held by the public rising from $31 trillion to $56 trillion. Interest costs doubling from $1 trillion to $2.1 trillion per year. And three critical trust funds approaching insolvency. The Highway Trust Fund by 2028, the Social Security Retirement Fund by 2032, and the Medicare Hospital Insurance Fund by approximately 2040. When the Social Security Trust Fund runs out, which the CBO now projects will happen in just 6 years, benefits will be automatically cut by roughly 23% unless Congress acts. That means tens of millions of retirees who planned their lives around those payments will receive less than they were promised. Not because of economic collapse, because of arithmetic. The money going out exceeds the money coming in, and the reserve fund that covered the difference is almost empty. Now add the wild card. The Supreme Court is expected to rule soon on whether the current tariff regime is legally valid. If the court strikes down a significant portion of the tariffs, $3 trillion in projected revenue disappears from the government's books. In that scenario, the CBO warns that deficits could reach $3.8 trillion per year by 2036, and debt would hit 131% of GDP. At that point, and this is a direct quote from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, a debt spiral would be far more likely, and the risk of a fiscal crisis would grow. The word crisis is doing a lot of work in that sentence. The CRFB, which is the most respected nonpartisan budget watchdog in Washington, published a companion report last month titled, "What Would a Fiscal Crisis Look Like?" They identified 6 distinct types of crisis that could result from the current trajectory. A financial crisis, where bond markets seize up, interest rates spike uncontrollably, and the government cannot roll over its maturing debt. An inflation crisis, where the Fed prints so much money to cover the debt that prices spiral out of control. An austerity crisis, where the government is forced to cut spending so drastically that it triggers a deep recession. The CRFB estimated that a fiscal contraction equivalent to 5% of GDP could reverse modest growth into a 3% economic shrinkage, a recession deeper than any in the post-war era. This is exactly what happened in Greece in 2010. Economic weakness led to unsustainable borrowing costs. Creditors demanded austerity. The government slashed spending. Unemployment skyrocketed. The economy contracted for 6 consecutive years. And the country lost roughly a quarter of its GDP. The United States is not Greece, but the mechanism is the same. When debt becomes unserviceable, someone pays. The only question is who. A currency crisis, where the dollar loses its status as the global reserve currency, and every import becomes dramatically more expensive. A default crisis, where the government simply fails to make a payment, triggering a cascade through global financial markets. Or a gradual crisis, the slow erosion of living standards as more and more of the national income goes to debt service instead of investment, infrastructure, and opportunity. The CRFB concluded that some form of crisis is almost inevitable if the current trajectory continues. Not possible. Almost inevitable. And this is not happening in a vacuum. The rest of the world is watching. Central banks are diversifying away from the dollar. Gold has surged roughly 60% in the past year as governments and investors look for alternatives to a currency backed by a government drowning in debt. Bitcoin has risen for similar reasons, not because of speculation, but because of a genuine loss of confidence in the long-term stability of fiat currencies. The Doge Initiative, the Department of Government Efficiency, was created with the stated goal of cutting $2 trillion in waste, fraud, and abuse. Budget analysts estimate that actual savings have been between $1.4 and $7 billion. Not trillion, billion. The gap between the promise and the reality tells you everything you need to know about how seriously Washington is treating this problem. Meanwhile, the government is borrowing $43.5 billion per week. Every week. That is $6.2 billion per day. $4.3 million per minute, $70,000 per second. Every second of every day, the debt grows by $70,000, and nobody in a position of power is doing anything to stop it. Here is what this means for ordinary people, because the numbers are so large that they can feel abstract, and abstraction is exactly how crises like this go unaddressed until it is too late. If you have a mortgage, a car loan, or any form of debt, your interest rates are connected to the government's borrowing costs. When the government borrows more, it competes with you for the same pool of lending capital. Interest rates rise, your mortgage payment goes up at renewal, your car loan costs more, your credit card rate increases. The government's debt crisis becomes your debt crisis. Not in some distant future, but in your next monthly statement. If you are saving for retirement, your savings are denominated in dollars. Every dollar the Federal Reserve creates to cover the government's borrowing dilutes the dollars already in your account. You do not see a withdrawal. You see the price of groceries, rent, and healthcare rising faster than your savings grow. That is not inflation caused by strong demand. That is inflation caused by a government that cannot fund itself without devaluing its own currency. If you are young, the consequences are even more direct. Every dollar spent on interest is a dollar not spent on infrastructure, education, research, housing, or the investments that create economic opportunity for the next generation. The CBO projects that by 2036, the government will spend more on interest payments than on national defense. More than on all non-defense discretionary spending combined. That includes education, transportation, science, housing, and environmental protection. An entire generation will enter the workforce in a country that spends more servicing its past debts than investing in its future. And if you live outside the United States, this affects you directly as well. The dollar is the foundation of the global financial system. Roughly 60% of global foreign exchange reserves are held in dollars. Most international trade is settled in dollars. Most commodities, oil, gold, copper, are priced in dollars. When the dollar weakens because the government is printing money to cover its debts, every country holding dollar reserves loses wealth. Every country importing dollar-priced commodities pays more. Every emerging market that borrowed in dollars finds its debt burden suddenly heavier. The American debt crisis is a global crisis hiding in plain sight. This is not a partisan issue. Both parties have contributed to this debt. Both parties have cut taxes and increased spending. Both parties have promised fiscal responsibility and delivered the opposite. The CBO report does not assign blame, it assigns numbers. And the numbers say the country is on a path that ends in one of 6 types of crisis, unless something fundamental changes. Dalio's recommendation is what he calls a 3% deficit plan, a combination of spending reductions, targeted revenue increases, and lower interest rates that would bring the annual deficit down to 3% of GDP. That is the threshold economists generally consider sustainable. Currently, the deficit is nearly 6%. Cutting it in half would require the kind of bipartisan cooperation that has not existed in Washington for decades. And even if that cooperation appeared tomorrow, the structural forces, an aging population, rising healthcare costs, compounding interest on existing debt, make the math extraordinarily difficult. So what happens next? If history is any guide, and Dalio has studied more history than almost anyone alive, what happens next is that the crisis builds slowly and then arrives suddenly. The patient ignores the warnings. The plaque builds. The arteries narrow. And then one day, one auction that fails, one credit downgrade that triggers a sell-off, one geopolitical shock that makes foreign buyers pause, the heart attack arrives. And when it does, the options narrow to 2. Print money and destroy the currency. Or do not print money and watch the economy collapse. That is the choice. And for the first time in the history of the United States, the numbers say that choice is no longer decades away. It is years away. The CBO projects the debt will surpass the World War II record by 2030, 4 years from now. And from there, it only accelerates. $56 trillion by 2036, $2.1 trillion in annual interest. Trust funds running dry. And a world that is quietly, steadily, losing confidence in the ability of the world's largest economy to manage its own finances. The report is public, the numbers are there for anyone to read, and the clock is running. To stay ahead of these shifts and understand what they mean for your money and the global economy, make sure you are following this channel, because this story is not going away. It is getting worse every single second.